Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. This is Saul Weinreb, the host of this podcast. Thank you for joining us again as we continue studying this extremely difficult and painful chapter, which is chapter 11 of the second book of Samuel, Shmuel Bet, Parak Yud Aleph. We are up to Pasuk, verse 16, Pasuk Tes Zayin. And we have just read of David's last attempt at covering up the sin. He slept with Bat Sheba, the wife of Uriah Hittite, and he attempted to cover it up by having Uriah sleep with his wife, but that didn't work. So now he is going to do the ultimate way of covering up his sin by having Uriah killed at battle. And he sent Yoav a message asking Yoav to place Uriah at the front lines during the heat of battle and then abandon him so that he fought alone against the enemy, thus exposing him to almost certain death. Of course, Yoav received this. Yoav has no idea about what happened at the time, and he presumably would assume that David had a good reason for wanting Uriah to be killed. So Vayihi b'shmor Yoav el ha'ir, when Yoav was besieging, he was guarding the city. In other words, as a siege, they laid around the city, guarding, making sure no one gets in or out, and continuing the battle. Vayitain es Uriah el makom, and he posted Uriah in a position, in a place, asher yada, that he knew ki anshe chayil sham, that there were warriors there. In other words, at a place where he knew the enemy had stationed solid warriors. Vayetzu anshe ha'ir, and the people of the city came out, vayilachamu et Yoav, and they waged war and battle, and they fought against Yoav and his men. Vayipol min ha'amei avdei David, and some of the people of the servants of David died. Vayamos gam Uriah Hittite, and in this battle, Uriah Hittite passed on as well. So this is Yoav accomplishing what David wanted to accomplish, and the verse seems to be presenting it in such a way that others fell in this battle as well. So in his attempt to only have Uriah killed, Uriah wasn't the only one who suffered, but other brave warriors suffered because of this act, placing them in a place which was well defended, which was not a very good tactical move, and exposed his soldiers to unnecessary risk in order to achieve the end result of having Uriah killed, and now other people get killed along with him. So this is just further driving home the depth of the sin that David had occurred and the consequences of attempting to cover up that sin, and then cover it up again and cover it up again, and more and more and more and more people suffer because of it. Vayishlach Yoav, and then Yoav sent a messenger, Vayaged David et kol divrei milchama, and he described all of the events of the battle. Now, obviously, Yoav is not just going to send back a letter and saying Uriah died, because a lot of people died. And if he sent back a message just saying Uriah died, it would look suspicious. It would seem that David was trying to cover something up. And remember, there were already people that knew that Bat Sheba was escorted to the king's house. So this is becoming a really big mess here. So Yoav, in order to send a message that looked realistic back, he says, Vayetzavet hamalach lemar. So in other words, Vayishlach Yoav, this is verse 18, Yoav sent a message, Vayaged David et kol divrei milchama. He gave him a report of everything that occurred in the battle. So he gave him a full briefing on the status of the battle against Ammon, which is typical and understandable for the general to send such a message back to the king. And then he said, Vayetzavet hamalach lemar, and then he told the messenger to say, Kichalot kol divrei milchama ledaber al melech. When you finish giving a report of all the battles, all the wins and the losses and the movements and the positions, etc., v'haya im ta'alech hamat hamelech. If the king gets angry at you, so Yoav has to present this to this messenger in a very kind of backhanded way to make sure the message gets across without the messenger knowing exactly what happened and why he has to get this message across. So he says the king is then going to get angry at you. Why did you do something so stupid? And expose the soldiers to such risk, right? So when the king gets angry, and he'll say to you, why did you come so close in battle to the city to wage war where you knew that was heavily fortified? Like why didn't you have a better strategy than that? Don't you know that they are going to shoot at you from on top of the walls? Like, how could that be so stupid? He's going to get mad. Like, what kind of a stupid strategy is that? And this is Yoav imagining the kind of speech that the king would give. He says, Mihi koat Avimelech ben Yerubeshet. If you remember back in the book of Judges, we learned the story of Avimelech, who declared himself king, who was an abusive, vicious, murderous dictator, who was, which we read about in the book of Judges, who was an awful person, and we knew he met his ignominious end by being killed by a woman who was standing at the top of the wall and dropped a rock on his head. So Isha hishlicha of pelach rechev me'alachoma. A woman had dropped from the top of the wall a big millstone, right, from the wall. Vayamatz b'tevetz, and he ended and he died there in Tevetz. So I mean, anyone can kill anybody by dropping anything from the top of the wall, even a woman with a rock. So Lamani Gashtem Melachoma, why are you going to the wall? So when the king gets mad and says this, answer V'yamarta gam avdecha Uriah Hiti made. Then you should say that your servant Uriah the Hittite also passed in this battle. In other words, obviously you don't have an answer. You're not the one who made this strategy, but just tell him this news. That Uriah also passed away, and then the king will calm down because he'll understand that there was, that the purpose of the battle was fulfilled. Now, so this whole thing is one big mess. I mean, a mess on top of a mess on top of a mess, and a cover up after a cover up, and it just makes one's stomach turn. It's just to read this. But it is intended to read that way, and that's the experience that we're supposed to experience when we read this. So the messenger went vayavo, and he arrived at the palace. Vayagelu David, and he told David, "It's kol asher shlacho Yoav," everything that Yoav had told him. Vayomer hamalach el David, and the messenger told David, "Ki gavru aleinu ha'anashim," that the men, in other words, the Ammonite, the enemy soldiers, were more powerful. They were powered over us. And they came out against us in the field. So he painted a story that described why they approached the wall. So we chased them back until we got to the gate. And once we got to the gate, then the archers that were standing on the top of the wall started shooting arrows to your servants, to your men. Vayamusu me'avdei hamelach, and of the servants of the king, many died. V'gam avdecha Uriah Hiti meis, and even your servant Uriah the Hittite, Uriah Hiti, also passed away. Vayomer David hamalach. So David had to react in such a way that he cared about the loss of his soldiers. He couldn't act, satisfied that Uriah had passed. So he said, now you go back to Yoav and give him this message. Ko tomar el Yoav. This is what you should say to Yoav. Al yera be'einecha et hadavar hazeh. Don't let this thing be bad. In other words, don't be depressed over this loss, this terrible loss that happened. Ki kazov v'chazeh tochal hechorev. Because this is how things go. This is how battle goes. The sword, it eats. The sword destroys in battle. Strengthen your war against the city, and you can destroy it and you could take over it, and give him strength. And that's what you should do. In other words, give Yoav the general strength. And now the awful tragedy has now reached the ears of his wife, of Bat Sheba. She heard that her husband that her husband Uriah had passed. Vatispod al ba'ala, and she was sad, and she was lamented over the loss of her husband. And this is the ultimate tragedy, has now come full circle to a woman having lost her husband in battle as a result of the deeds of the king. After her period of mourning passed, Vayishlach David, and David sent out Vayasfoel Beiso, and he gathered her into his home, Vatihilo Liisha, and she became his wife. So this is also part of the cover-up. By bringing him into his house, he's trying to set up a face like, well, my trusted soldier died. I will be kind and bring his wife into the palace and make her my wife, so to take care of her. And then he can also cover up the legitimacy of the child and just say that it's his child because he brought her in. Vayira davar asher David, and this thing which David had done was very bad be'enei Adonai, in the eyes of God, and that is a major understatement. So this is how the story it doesn't really conclude, because it's going to have repercussions continuing through the rest of David's life. But this is the end of this episode. In my next podcast, I am going to just mention a few points about this story that I think are important. Thank you so much for studying this together. Looking forward to studying chapter 12 and, of course, the rest of the book of Samuel together.